Within a few minutes, we stopped and sat outside the atmosphere of a very large planet. Millions of transportation vehicles of every shape and size were floating motionless in all directions around us. Not knowing where we wanted to set down, Jack took manual control of the vehicle. I was relieved that I didn't throw up because there was no bucket in the craft, which made me a little nervous since I got sick leaving academy. We spent some time looking at other transportation vehicles. As we did, we pulled alongside a large craft that looked like an ocean liner. Jack told me about a tour company that used these liners to sail through the Rose Nebula. The Rose Nebula was an area in space with a red sun circled by a vast dust cloud and asteroid field. The red sun's reflection on the dust turned the whole cloud to the color of a brilliant red rose. Often, asteroids carved through the dust creating an illusion of petals. When that takes place, the asteroids themselves reflected like multicolored jewels. Many of them contained different crystallized elements. I guess it was another popular must-see attraction in Sierra. Jack said, although the cruise is enjoyed by everyone, it is particularly popular for young newlywed couples. I commented to Jack, I gather there must be more things to do here than people to do them. He acknowledged, no doubt. Sierra is a fun place. We moved a little farther east where we could see a group of 14 moons coming up over the horizon. They almost looked mechanical, being spaced equally apart and lined up, each one at different stages of eluding the light of the sun hiding on the other side of the planet. Because the sun was on the other side, we could see large lit structures on the surface below us. I walked down into the galley to grab a soda. When I came back to the bridge, Jack was speaking with someone and ended the conversation once I emerged from the galley. He looked at me and directed my attention to a spot on the planet below us, and then headed for it. He set the vehicle down in a parking area next to a small brick building that looked like a subway entrance. Again, transportation vehicles of every shape and size spread out in all directions as far as the eye could see. Once Jack stepped outside the vehicle, he contacted transportation asking them to activate the vehicle last used by Jeff Flake. He had landed the craft in the area of the cabin I had just stayed at in the backwoods of Academy. I saw lights come on approximately 100 feet away. We walked over to the lights and to my astonishment there sat that same cabin. Then Jack said, I didn't remember the number of the cabin, but transportation keeps track of our use of any transport vehicles. So, that one being the last one you used, transportation found it easily. Okay, that makes sense, I replied. Surrounding that little cabin were other similar cabins, many several times larger than the little cabin I used. I said, many of these cabins are much larger than the one I stayed in. Obviously, you have an inclination to think small and comfortable most the time, Jeff. Regarding those bigger cabins, there's no limitation on size for a vehicle, or cabin in this case. There are vehicles as small as motorcycles and as large as small moons. I have no inkling why anyone built one that big or what use they'd have for it, but they exist. Remember those 14 moons rising in the east? They are not moons, but vehicles. They're like, what's the old term, Dyson spheres, as each one has its own atmosphere and climate within. Unlike the Dyson sphere, the sun, moon and stars are created within rather than trapped. Perhaps, we could explore one sometime, because they are insane inside. The creativity is out of this world, he said, pun intended, as he smiled at me. I replied, yes, I'd like to do that. I almost suggested we do it now, but we are here to look over the facilities and I didn't want to get too distracted from our initial purpose. We returned to the small entrance we landed next to and walked down a flight of stairs. Once below, we came out into a large underground tunnel system. Both sides of the tunnel or hall contained small 4-inch by 4-inch glass doors. You'd think we had just walked into a large post office. I couldn't see the end of the hall and the glass doors stacked 14 feet high as the tunnels stretched, winding and zigzagging around the whole planet. Each small glass door held a small box with a red flashing light on the front. These were the CIO special modules. The KIO companion modules had a green flashing light on the front. The brains in those boxes, both special and companion, composed of small 2" by 2" by 1" carbon, crystal, and gold central processing units, or modules, all created and stored here on transport. Every quarter mile we passed a small alcove or room. Each one, along the back wall, was full of windows with comfortable pillow-top benches built into them. Each room looked out onto different artificial landscapes. The first one we stopped at looked out into a forest with large trees. I could see mountains on the horizon. It was the middle of the day and the sunlight fell through the windows. It felt cozy and warm as if the sun was coming through the windows. Jack walked over to a panel and turned a dial, and the more he turned the dial the more the time of day changed. The room became dusk and a brilliant full moon rose above the mountains. The forest took on the character of long shadows with the light of the moon making eerie paths between the trees. I imagined myself resting on the bench in the middle of the day as the trees shaded the room reading my favorite literature. Jack turned the dial back to the middle of the day and then turned a dial next to that one. At which time it clouded up and rained. The more he turned that dial the harder the rain, changing the sky from fluffy white cumulus clouds to a heavy downpour like a monsoon. Other than it being a most beautiful invention, I had no clue why the rooms existed, neither did Jack. I assumed he knew everything. We came to other similar rooms. One in particular I liked opened to a meadow full of plants and bushes in bloom. Several large mule deer stood around eating from the bushes. I almost forgot why we came to transport after spending time in those rooms. After visiting several of the rooms, we restricted ourselves to observing the AI. We told ourselves we'd come back at a later date to see more of the rooms. One would be perfect in my business-like library. We continued down the halls looking at all of the small mail-like boxes as we traveled. Every now and then, I would get up close to peer into one of the small enclosures. I guess I was hoping to see something extraordinary, but they were all the same to one another. When completed, the AI modules, called specials, were set into any creature-like or machine-type structure and that structure became the body of that special AI module. They were much less advanced than the companion modules, and often in the form of unnatural, even scary-looking creatures. Mostly, those diverse forms proved more useful in providing specific services than the natural-looking forms. The more advanced companions were set in a more natural body, or form, simulating, more perfectly a human or an animal. We walked for a half a mile when we came to a heavy solid metal door. It opened to an enormous underground cavern. As I was saying, the specials might take on unique forms. The cavern contained wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling, forms that looked similar to big 10-legged spiders. I said wow. Jack said, we are in the farm section of transport. These creatures were built for the farm industry and used to pick fruit and berries. They're designed this way to make them fast and gentle at the same time. After he disclosed that, he shouted, anyone here? One special dangling on the wall behind us and above the door responded, hi, how can I help you? Jack replied, hi, what is your name, please? My name is Claude. I am a farm foreman waiting for activation. I am a farmhand supervisor. I am in status with my module intact so I can manage inventory, which means I determine what forms go where and when, he responded. Did he need to say all that? Well, I suppose it was routine for a supervisory special to give such a lengthy introduction or greeting. Jack then said, that is fine, but what I was more interested in is seeing your devices used to pick fruit from the orchards. Are you equipped? Yes, I am, he said as his belly opened and 24 small hand-sized spider-looking creatures came clambering out, then ran up my leg, and covered my body. I knew they would not hurt me, but it creeped me out. Jack looked at me and said, do you want a haircut, Jeff? They will do an amazing job if you like bowl cuts. No thanks. I responded as the little creatures climbed down and retreated to the foreman's body. The creature was very astute and answered Jack's other questions with a high level of intelligence. I don't understand why it sent its little machines up my leg. I assumed it did so of its own accord, so I guess it had a human-like awareness of humor. The creatures or farm hands were designed in such a way so they could stand over a row of strawberries and use 4 legs to move along the row and the other 6 to pick berries. They could move along a row of raspberries and pick them many times faster than a human could. Their shape allowed them to pick every type of fruit or vegetable. The small hand-size rodents climbed trees and snipped hanging fruit at the stem. 2 of their legs held onto the fruit and lowered it down to cuts below them, never bruising the fruit, and they did so quickly. Jack turned and said, "You think these guys are creepy looking? You should see the carpenter specials. They look like men with 4 legs and 4 arms and can climb up the side of a building's flat surface. They could measure, cut, nail and level any board by sight, and do it 20 times faster than a man. Those men you saw earlier, on the way to town, were not specials. I suspect they were friends of the landowner. Sometimes people prefer to do their own thing. We're all that way regarding something or another. The carpenter specials can build a spacious mansion in 2 days, 48 hours. We came across many forms of specials, some mechanical and ancient looking, some futuristic looking, and many others in between. It impressed me at that moment how civilization here in Sierra was predominantly old-fashioned. Honestly, no legitimate demand for these creatures existed. There were doubtless a million ways to harvest or complete a project without employing physical machinery or processes. It made me think of going through an attic full of antiques, every one of them intriguing. We find a special one, grab it, run downstairs, and place it in a favorite spot on the mantel where it became the conversation piece. I kept trying to wrap my head around that because I conceded Sierra to be a throwback in time. I suppose it was comfortable keeping it that way. We were a society of tinkers. If I let my mind go, I would undoubtedly spend years working, endeavoring to figure it out. The small magical library at the cabin came to mind. Then, I had to laugh at myself as soon as I remembered that I live in a different time on Earth, 1,000 times more primitive than Sierra. Jack asked, "What are you laughing at?" "Myself," I replied. He shook his head, and we moved on, passing through several caverns full of different forms constructed for the farm industry. We entered one cavern full of combines and other large farm machinery. Jack explained that the farm machinery was not built on transport, and the equipment was in the cavern for research and development only. An hour and a half later, we went through another door where the boxes displayed the green lights. We arrived in a companion's zone. Just the other side of that door we discovered another door leading into a restaurant. We elected to get something to eat. The restaurant was unusual as the waiters looked comparable to humans, but not entirely human, and spoke with a unique fuzzy voice. They had metal bodies with 4 arms and wore roller skates, which must have been a joke. Somebody certainly put their sense of humor to work here. Another group of people in the restaurant thought it amusing too, as I overheard them talking about it. We loitered at the restaurant for at least an hour, the food being that good. I was beginning to wonder if Jack would ever stop eating. Jack mentioned, the food is consistently good in these little restaurants here on transport. There are thousands of these small restaurants to feed loads of hungry tourists. I asked, "Aren't you full? You have been eating for an hour straight. How can you even do that?" "I was hungry, I guess," he said, chuckling. I figured we both found satisfaction in tormenting one another. Curiously, I didn't know much about Jack other than hanging around with him since I have come to Sierra. The memories I had about him were limited at best. Yet, I knew he was a good friend. I recalled many of my other good friends of whom I knew lived elsewhere in heaven, but I had seen none of them yet. I never said a word because I had this sense I was not here, as Jack pointed out, for that big family reunion. Perhaps, my purpose might get absorbed in those relationships. When Jack finally finished eating, we continued our walk through the halls of transport. One aspect about Jack, he was constantly ready to explain the details. He never insulted my intelligence other than to torment me, and when I got a certain expression on my face, he'd discern exactly what I was thinking. I asked him about it and he told me we had been working together for so long it became second nature for him to know my expressions. As we walked, I contemplated on how specials and companions interacted with the inhabitants of Sierra. Jack identified precisely what I had on my mind. He offered to explain the whole biography of the AI, and began by asking me, "Jeff, are you ready for a history lesson? I am not sure what you remember about transport and the AI, but if you want we can go over that history." "I am interested in what you have to say since I only recall bits and pieces without the full story," I replied. Jack started the lesson. This may be a bit redundant, but at first the AI specials were created by angels to help with the construction and development of Sierra itself. Say I worked around the clock without taking breaks. They became the builders, the construction workers, the field hands and whatever helped invent, create, and build Sierra. Of course, specials are limited to one occupation, but extremely qualified for those occupations, which was necessary for Sierra's completion. They started the farms on Cedar and maintained its resources and agriculture. They built all the cities and suburbs throughout. Now, you'd think because they're so specialized, they could not add that personal touch. That was not the case, as each special proved more than capable of independent thought and understood the different facets of the human touch, provided it related to their profession. I should point out that among the group was a particular number of specials called savants. When a task demanded an artist's touch, a savant was called upon to direct and produce that specialized detail. The savants designed much of the architecture throughout Sierra. A savant is the highest level of special created in Sierra. Once the humans moved in, it became the special's obligation to do the labor-intensive tasks not done by the humans themselves. Now, they work on the farms and ranches on Cedar. They do all the public works and perform all the maintenance tasks of large buildings throughout Sierra. Many of them work in the factories. If there was a job, a special was more than likely doing it. Just before the citizens moved into Sierra, the angels programmed the KI, companions, with the primary purpose of acting as personal companions to the citizens. Companions had the full range of human intelligence and emotion. Each one grew alongside their human counterpart, just like that small creature following the little girl around the park, and lived with them and interacted as if human themselves. They taught the citizens how to get around, how to buy essentials and other general issues pertaining to normal life in Sierra. Once those issues no longer existed, it became their responsibility to help with education by being tutors to the children, along with their parents. Also, once Sierra was established, companions performed more basic household functions such as doing the daily chores families did not have time for, such as Dana and Bart do. Fortunately, for either group, artificial intelligence doesn't differentiate between important and menial tasks. There was never any exploitation or disrespect towards an AI. Things that needed to be done just had to be done. I interrupted, "I haven't noticed a companion following you around." Jack responded, "Like you, I have two companions that do exactly as Bart and Dana do for you. Because we have never been to my home since you have been here, it only makes sense that you would not have seen either of them. Their names are Harrison and Matilda, Harry and Mel. You have seen them thousands of times, but I guess they were not important to your story that you should remember them." "Oh," I replied. "No worries, Jeff. I am sure you will see them in the future should they become pertinent." I didn't respond, and Jack continued, "So far, 800 billion of the AI modules have been created and housed here, 200 billion KI and 600 billion SAI. 650 billion AI are currently unused and in status. When not in use, AI survives in a hive society, such as ants or bees. When not busy aiding the humans, they connect into the hive to socialize with other companions, collecting information or furnishing information to one another. That connection was called gossiping. Because AI, particularly companions, love knowledge, the hive became their favorite place to be, gossiping. Regardless of their eagerness to be in the hive, a companion's principal purpose is to be actively engaged with humans. Take note, once linked with a citizen, and unless authorized, AI are prohibited from giving or inserting human personal information into the hive. That was a fundamental rule built into all AI programming. As you already know, Transit is the fourth largest planet in Sierra, with millions of these natural underground tunnels such as the one we're in, and each tunnel lined with AI connected to the hive by millions of miles of circuitry. Also, most buildings throughout Sierra, including homes, provide a closet-size room with the appropriate circuitry for companions to join the hive during downtime, while away from transit. That way companions outside the hive can connect and assemble information shared by the hive. As we entered another cavern, I noticed the cavern itself was empty, except on two sides of its walls were 6, 8 by 20 foot heavy glass windows. We walked up to one window to the right to peer inside. The walls inside were painted white and looked like a laboratory. Hundreds of assembly lines, full of specials along with hundreds of tiny angels, sat 10 feet apart, and each one was over 100 feet long. I could not tell how many rows there were as I could not see all the way to the back of the room. Jack informed me they were assembling the special modules. The specials and the tiny angels worked together making their modules. The specials put the base components together, and the angels performed all the finishing touches. I didn't get a good look at the angels as they moved too fast for me to follow. I'd get a glimpse for a second when one would stop briefly and then move on. Again, those specials operating the assembly lines did not look human at all. Each one had 3 sections, one top, one middle and one bottom. Each section of the special twisted independent of the others. They were box-shaped and stood 5 feet tall, 4 feet wide. Their top section had 4 pairs of eyes, one set front, each side and the back. Their middle section had 6 arms attached, and hands with 10 dexterous fingers attached with which they were moving quickly putting the small modules together. Their bottom section had 4 legs attached, which made them look like a coffee table. Their eyes were big and wide with retinas that looked like telescopes, which were moving in and out from their rounded earless head. One set kept an eye on incoming product, one set kept an eye on what they were doing to that product, and another set watched the product move on down the line. I didn't know what the back pair were for, but one creature looked at me, turned its head, as its telescope eyes shifted towards me to focus. Afterward, it turned its head back to finish its work. I think it smiled at me. It didn't have a mouth, but I am sure it smiled. We found a door into the lab, and as soon as we opened it everything became silent and stood still, including the specials. A couple seconds later music came on, instrumental, and they picked up right where they left off. A minute later, the creatures moved to the music. Their heads spun, and their feet swayed in place. All the while, their arms continued assembling the modules without missing a beat. A group of tourists came through the door right after we did, and the same thing happened. I overheard the tour guide tell his tour group these companions work better when they heard instrumental music. I thought, how cool, as the song Moon River played in the background while the specials worked. I walked over and stood by the tour guide as he was explaining the features of the lab and the AI. He said, A.I.'S. Don't need ears or mouths to communicate. They correspond by Wi-Fi, which is much faster and more efficient in communicating their ideas. Often they connect with another AI, and that AI would see in their electronic mind the same thing the sending AI is seeing. If there was ever a problem, the whole group could get involved to resolve it. There was never any confusion between them, which is true among all AI, for both the specials and companions. One tourist asked, why the music, if they don't have ears to hear it? He responded, it is not the music they hear, it is the vibration they feel. When Todd Williams, the creator of these AI, was on Earth, he was deaf. He could only feel the vibrations created by music. Classical and instrumental music were the only vibration that didn't give him a headache. Todd preferred the vibrations over the actual sound, so he included that ability in these creatures. It was his creative signature. That's the rumor, anyway. After a while, the tour group went one way, and we went the other. A half-mile down the tunnel, we came upon another lab. Inside the lab were hundreds of small glass cases. A special was placing the tiny modules into the case. It closed the lid and thousands of electrical charges, like lightning, filled the box. Jack, now acting the tour guide, said, Once a companion module has been created, it was mounted in those sealed electrical cases. The cases are designed to set off electrical charges or small lightning strikes. Both the case and the companion module contain over 2,000 receptors charged by random strikes. Each receptor determines a personality trait. The charges can strike several receptors at a time, which sets another personality trait. Since trillions of sequences are possible, no two companions are exactly alike. The specials used a different sealed case because they were not charged in the same manner. A special only received specific electrical charges based on the profession they needed to mimic. They didn't need a personality, they only needed to communicate within their specific profession. Companions needed every facet of human intelligence and personality to interact with their human counterparts. Families often had 10 companions. The bigger farms on Cedar could have 50 or more companions to supervise thousands of specials who worked on those farms. There was never an issue with availability. If a need arose, there was an AI to fill the need. We walked until we came to a large door. On the other side was a massive factory. It was not as much a cavern as it was a dome covering a deep pit. It must have been 100 miles long and wide. We could see the stars above with the Leaf Galaxy distinctly in the background. The Leaf Galaxy was one of the 5 galaxies that made up Sierra. We were no longer in the AI department, as thousands of specials were building and performing maintenance on hundreds of transportation vehicles. Millions of AI, both companion and special, served on transport in this area where transportation vehicles were designed and built. They built each craft based on specific blueprints and detailed orders, although there was no design limitation or size constraint. Even though this cavern was huge, the larger craft were built outside in the open. I thought about the cabin I found on Academy and how it was constructed as a vacation home for citizens who travel into the outback. We loved our Aussies and stole that term from them whenever someone travels to or stays in a remote location. The noise inside the cavern was way too loud. When we entered the factory, the door opened to a wide metal-graded platform. At both ends of the platform were convertible craft, flat and round with a clear bottom. The crafts could hold 4 to 50 people. We walked over to one 4-passenger vehicle. Jack reached down into a glove box, then pulled out and handed me a pair of headphones. That helped a great deal, as they served not only to deaden the sound, they transmitted our voices to one another. We took one of the craft to the other end of the factory, which took 3 hours to cross as we stopped periodically to observe what was taking place below us. Once across, we got out and walked again. After another half hour, we came upon a large glass door. Jack said, "I think you will like this." I replied, "We have covered a lot of ground today already. I think this will be the last place we stop before I go home." It was the CTC, Central Transportation Command. Several companions ran the center and were in charge of several hundred specials who operated it. All transportation was controlled from the CTC on transport. Once inside, I noticed a large screen at the back of the room. It must have been 150 feet wide and 40 feet tall. The official companion on duty came over to us, greeted us saying, "Welcome to CTC." I hardly noticed her as I turned my attention to the large grid full of light. The grid displayed every planet and designated location within the Sirian system. Hundreds of satellites surrounded every planet and exhibited on the grid as small yellow lights. Although a planet has hundreds, all represented by a single yellow light, unless they fall into an error state, which has never happened. If any part of the system enters an error state, a red light announced it, whether it was a satellite or a vehicle. At which time, they sent repair crews to make needed repairs. When a transportation vehicle was in use, it was marked on the grid by a blue light. Tens of thousands of vehicles might be on the grid at any one time, so it might display thousands of blue lights. When the vehicle leaves one area, it messages, through the grid, to any satellite near the destination area it needed to enter. The communication between current location and destination only took seconds to create, via a communications wormhole. Otherwise, it might take generations for a transmission to reach the CTC. Interestingly, Communication between satellites, vehicles and the grid often made the grid difficult to read for mortals. With the thousands of vehicles on the grid at any one time, the indicator lights became blurred. So, watching the grid often made a mortal dizzy. They created specialized AI for the system, to read the grid, monitor it, and direct the heavy traffic in all of known space. Once a vehicle and a satellite connect, it would open a pattern between the two. A pattern is what we Sirians call this method of travel. It isn't a wormhole as it is more of a pattern buffer. The manager was talking while we were standing there, but I didn't hear a thing she said, being lost in my thoughts. She returned to her desk as another companion was standing there expecting to converse with her. I knew this much about transportation without being told. Going from place to place used the same concept by which immortals and angels move from place to place. They can do so by a simple word. Patterns were their mechanical version. It was beyond the simple act of folding space to make instant transport. It forced a group of molecules in space, your location, to connect to another group somewhere else in space, your destination, and cause them to act as if they were in the same location. They called those points in space identical patterns, as on a subatomic level they became exact copies of each other. Then, moving in any direction materialized your vehicle at the new location. Sometimes when moving you felt a minor vibration. That was what I understood. I asked Jack about more detail and when he tried explaining it his language changed, and I couldn't understand a word he said. I remember once asking Bart a question about it a while back and when he tried to explain it, the same thing happened. I asked Pete one morning. He told me the cows were out in the hay and walked away singing the old grey mare. I could only speculate what he was thinking. Many things in Sierra left me clueless how or why they worked. I assumed the powers that be believed I shouldn't learn those things. Perhaps, they suspected I might use such knowledge to my advantage when I returned to my Earth. It was becoming a regular event when I asked a question I got an odd and unpredictable response. Well, each vehicle, showed by a blue flash, enters the pattern and materializes at its destination. Once there, another blue flash indicated it has re-entered normal space, which only takes seconds. Thousands of vehicles can enter or leave an area in the matter of minutes. It takes 3 seconds for a vehicle and a satellite to open communications, end communications, and set a point in space to set the patterns. The grid here at the central office includes 42 green lights around its outer perimeter. Each one represented Sierra and the other 41 similar systems in space. One purple light in the center of the grid represented Earth. Every region has 100 satellites placed in the other regions to allow citizens access to travel between regions. Somewhere in Sierra, out in space, sits an array of 4,200 satellites to cross between systems. Once a vehicle enters a new region, CTC transfers them to that region's grid. There was a line of 70 specials standing across the front of the grid. They reminded me of old Gumby toys from the 1950s, flat and kind of scary looking. Apparently, that was because they have to move from side to side without obstruction, and that flat form made such a movement easy. Not one of them said a thing. The supervising companion explained they need not speak as they are all connected through a central hub in the middle of the room. Communications needed to be fast to operate the system and spoken language was just too slow. I guess they were mind readers, Wi-Fi. It was amazing, not only for AI's ability to run transportation, they proved themselves so important to the overall operation of Sierra, as there were as many A.I.'s, as there were things to do. We stayed for 2 hours in the command center observing. Afterward, Jack asked me if I were hungry again. I looked at him hard and long, then said, I was, and we left. Then said, I was, and we left. Then said, I was, and we left. Then said, I was, and we left.